Welcome everyone to the 52nd Virtual Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. It's been a couple of months because we're starting to slow down the frequency of hosting these roundtables. As many of you will already know, I just launched a couple of weeks ago a new webinar series that has a broader scope just than measuring corruption. That's not to say that there's not a lot to say about measuring corruption, but again, this is the 52nd meeting for a reason. There's a lot of ground that we've already covered. Um, but it's still a number of interesting discussion ahead. And I'm so excited today to welcome Alexandra Gillies from OCCRP. OCCRP is an organization that I've been following for quite some time, and I've been just dying to get an opportunity to host a presentation by them. And when I saw the release of this new project that Alexandra will be telling us about today, I thought, oh, this is a perfect opportunity to convince them to come and talk with us. So before I invite her to introduce herself and start sharing her screen, just a couple of notes about how the meeting will be structured. We may make it a little shorter than usual. As the majority of you know, usually we run up to 90 minutes. Potentially today we'll be wrapping up around 60 minutes. I don't want to make any promises, but just so you know that it may be a little shorter than usual. Uh, as always, I do encourage questions and comments through the presentation. So if you have it, if you think of something that you would like to contribute to the conversation, or if there's any point in particular from Alexandra's presentation that you would like to speak about, do not feel shy, and please don't just leave it for the very end, because we don't know how much time we'll have at the very end. Feel free to hit the hand emoji or just wave at the camera, and I'll invite you to unmute yourself and participate. If you do so the first time, I would love it if you could just very, very briefly introduce yourself. What is your affiliation? What brings you to this conversation? So that potentially, because again, we are all here because we're interested in one way or another on the topic of measurement of corruption. So potentially there may be other members of this event that would like to get in touch with you later. Okay. So, I am José Poche Álvarez, the host of this webinar series called Roundtable for whatever reason. And I'm associate professor at the University of Osaka. And again, I'm very grateful for seeing you all here today. And Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Joseph, and thanks all for being here. It's a very impressive set of events that you've organized, and I can see why with this topic that you would need 52 sessions to try to figure out how best to measure corruption because it's extremely difficult. Um, this is an issue that I've kind of followed from a bit of a distance for many years. Um, I Before I joined OCCRP about 3.5 years ago, and before that worked at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, which is an international NGO. And for 8 or 9 years, my boss was Danny Kaufman, who some of you would know from developing the governance matters indicators at the World Bank. And so really one of the kind of forefathers of trying to measure corruption. And so I feel like it's like baked into me a little bit from that experience. Um, I want to talk about kind of four things today. I'm not going to use slides just to keep it a bit more informal. After the session, Joseph has kindly agreed to email around some links to some of the investigations and resources that I'll mention. Um, so the four things that I want to talk about, one is a bit of an introduction about OCCRP and what I do there and um, our work. The second is looking at how investigative journalism exposes corruption, which obviously is essential to measuring it in some instances. Third, we'll be looking at how we measure the impact of our reporting, which I think is relevant in some ways. And then last is to talk about the new initiative that Joseph mentioned and that attracted his attention, I guess, which is a way for investigative journalists and academic researchers to work together more effectively. So that's what I'm hoping we'll cover. And I really very much look forward to interaction and questions and comments. It's a relatively small group, so hopefully we can have a conversation. So I work for the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. OCCRP is about 17, 18 years old. It's a global network of investigative journalists that, as the name suggests, focuses on cross-border corruption and organized crime. We produce investigations. We publish around 120 investigations a year. And during the course of this little talk, I'll give some examples of what those investigations are. Some of you may be familiar with our work. We have a large research and data team, and a lot of data and technology tools, all of which are quite necessary if you're trying to investigate cross-border financial crime. A lot of our work is very focused on kind of following the money. In addition to publishing our investigations, I should say that also our investigations are typically collaborations. For instance, a big story we published last year about investment scams, had 30 partners across Europe, including, Le Monde and major newspapers in Sweden and Denmark and Germany, in order for our investigations to reach a wider audience. In addition to publishing stories, OCCRP is also a network. We have 75 member centers, and most of these are small independent newsrooms, and many of them are in countries where it's quite difficult to be a small independent group of investigative journalists. And so we provide to those organizations a number of services. They get access to our research and data team. They get access to our technology tools. Our security team provides them with training, but also like actual security services and emergency response support. We provide legal, editorial, fact-checking support. And as a result of that, you can have a 3 or 4 person operation in North Macedonia who has access to a world-class data team or a world-class research team. So I think that networked aspect is really crucial to kind of what sets OCCRP apart. I lead our impact team, which is probably something a bit unique. We track the impact of our reporting, but even more importantly, we actively work to increase the impact of what the journalists uncover. And we do that through collaboration with other anti-corruption stakeholders, investigative journalists, just like law enforcement, just like policymakers. We're not working in a vacuum. There's like a whole anti-corruption ecosystem that's needed, and we constitute one part of that. And so my team's role is really to make sure that our findings are ending up in the hands of other actors who can use them to go after corruption. And that could be policy reform, that could be law enforcement action, that could be protests, that could be, civil society advocacy. And so we have a number of collaborations with NGOs who kind of take our reporting and then use it in their advocacy, in legal casework. But we also do a lot of outreach to policymakers. We present our findings to law enforcement in some instances. So really try to be as open as possible to increase the likelihood that when we expose wrongdoing, something actually happens after that. So that's my role within OCCRP, is kind of overseeing that effort. Before that, as I mentioned, I worked on extractive sector governance issues for many years, particularly oil sector corruption. I wrote a book about that, and that was kind of the subject of my PhD work as well. So that's a little bit about me. I'm based in Amsterdam. So with that kind of introduction in place, I want to talk a bit about kind of what investigative journalism does best, which is to detect and expose corruption.
Yeah.
And
Alexandra,
obviously this, yeah, sorry.
if I may ask a question about what you were just explaining to us about the work of OCCRP, would that be fine? Yes?
Yeah, of course.
Uh, so OCCRP, as you mentioned, so it's been, doing this excellent global work for a number of years. Uh, for example, one of the areas of work that I write about is that specifically of geopolitical corruption or strategic corruption. And one of the cases that I normally like comes to mind when thinking about the reporting of CCRP is that of a laundromat in Azerbaijan. Yes. Um, so I was wondering if when discussing about the network of OCCRP, right? So you work with this or you have these affiliate investigative journalists at the local level. You gave the example of North Macedonia. I imagine that means that the decision on which cases to pursue or kind of like what to look into, those decisions are done at the local level, and then OCCRP at the center kind of support that effort. Am I getting that right?
It varies from case to case. I would say a lot of our investigations come from member center evidence, well, where they'll have a lead,
Mm.
where they come across some data, uh, but they need the cross-border network in order to follow the story. So yeah, that definitely is a very common way that our investigations come about. Um, it's not the only way. We at OCCRP have data journalists who are, combining different data sets, looking for leads themselves. We get evidence leaked to OCCRP centrally sometimes. And then other times we're approached by kind of more mass media organizations when they have an investigation. Like we just had a major newspaper in Belgium approach us because they wanted to do a story that required some collaboration from journalists in Ukraine. And, this Belgian newspaper doesn't have a Ukrainian correspondent, where we have three or four amazing Ukrainian partners. And so we're able to kind of broker those partnerships. So I think those are kind of the different routes that the stories come from.
Oh, that's great. I'm really happy that you very much clarified or emphasized that point about this. I guess at this point that the transnational nature of a lot of cases of corruption that we see happening today is something that again, as you know, as a member of academia as well, uh, more and more we see research on. But by far, still the majority of the literature on corruption and anti-corruption kind of takes as granted that this happens at the state level or the national level, right? And so
Mhm.
if I get it right, that the focus of OCCRP is more at the transnational level, would that be fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we work on cross-border corruption and crime. And I think yeah, anyone who's still talking about corruption as a national issue, I feel like is a little behind the times. Um,
Great, thank you.
sure. Um, so, obviously investigative journalists are one of the main sources of evidence about what corruption is happening around the world. So obviously that's a crucial input to a number of measurement approaches. If you're trying to kind of quantify the incidence or the scale of corruption, often cases that are exposed by journalists feed into that. Um, but this kind of reporting also affects perceptions of corruption because you've got people reading about the stories and the scandals, and those are often measured as well. Either way, it's pretty difficult to measure corruption that's never exposed. So this role of airing the dirty laundry, finding what's going wrong and getting it out into the public is really crucial. Investigative reporting, as we were kind of just talking about with the cross-border nature of it, it has some advantages over other sources of information and action on corruption, particularly because it is easier for journalists to collaborate across countries than it is for law enforcement. There are systems in place for law enforcement to cooperate, but even if you've got two jurisdictions that are really excited to work together and have that political will and interest, there's still a fair amount of bureaucracy they need to navigate, which takes time and effort. But then you also, of course, have jurisdictions where investigating a certain corruption case is not at all of interest, and they'll play more of an obstructing role. What we've really seen over the past 15 years, particularly in the wake of the Panama Papers, is this explosion of cross-border investigative journalism, where OCCRP and other networks have gotten quite good at it. And now it was seen, 15 years ago as something really new. Now it's seen as like the only way to do this work properly. And so you can have really seamless collaboration across borders, which means we're able to report on stories in a way that is very complementary to what law enforcement can do. And we hear that feedback from the authorities regularly, that they draw on our reporting to find new cases, but also to supplement the investigations that they're doing. So I think it's hopefully clear that investigative reporting is a really important source of evidence. But one of the challenges for using this evidence to measure corruption is that the distribution of reporting, it depends on so many factors other than just the scale and severity of corruption. Like the investigations of corruption that are put out by journalists in a given year do not reflect the severity of corruption around the world.
Right. Alexandra,
Yeah.
there's a question here by Tiago. I also had a question, but I would like to invite Tiago first.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So my name is Tiago. I'm on Interpol Financial Crime and Corruption Center. I'm a law enforcement from a Polícia Judiciária, which is a federal police in Portugal for the last 31 years. I worked on drug trafficking, corruption, and money laundering all my life, and now I'm on Interpol. Yes, you just said something very interesting, which is, of course, it's very difficult for you to measure how corruption is all around the world, because I believe that you work with data that it's public, or it's very difficult for you to understand what's behind the scenes, of course. But it's a very interesting work that you do, and it's very important. But I want to shine out something that it's very interesting. That I was last week in South America because of the case, and there was a saying that shine out in my mind, which is, without corruption there is no crime. So maybe one level of understanding, even without knowing what's behind, what's on the shadows of a country, is also the level of crime that it's happening, can show the index of corruption that is working on that country. Another thing, and this is a question for you, is how do you understand that the work that you provide can have any action on the corruption perception index? And also, and this is more an academic question, is you may understand that in some regions in the world, what's for you corruption or an act of corruption is not seen as an act of corruption in other countries. So we can say that some acts of corruption, it's seen as a social level from our side, on one side of the globe. And how do you measure, and how do you make it flow to understand what's the cultural view from a country that you can perceive it as an act of corruption? For them, it's just an act of friendship. And it's not even written on the legal. It's not even illegal on their framework to have that kind of act? That this is more an academic question, because actually I have my academic degree. I'm an anthropologist. Although I'm a police, I'm an anthropologist, and I have a post-graduation in criminology, and I am finishing also a master thesis regarding anthropology and corruption. So this is more my academic question for you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I mean, I don't think it's purely an academic question, because, our editors spend a lot of time thinking about which stories are worth telling, what constitutes wrongdoing, and what's in the public interest to report. And so what is corruption and what isn't is very relevant to that. And I'm going to get to it later, but I think the legal forms of corruption are among the most harmful. When we talk about state capture, when we talk about kleptocracy, I'm not talking about someone giving a pen to an official when they visit, because that's considered polite in their culture. I'm talking about ruling families who distort the entire economy of a country around the self-enrichment of their relatives and their inner circle. In many instances, that's legal. And it's an extremely harmful form of corruption that needs to be exposed and discussed. And so, yeah, I do think what counts as corruption, and taking an overly legalistic approach to that, lets a lot of people off the hook, who are engaged in those more systemic kinds of corruption. Joseph, did you want to come in too?
Yes, I had a question as well about that, about the role of investigative journalists, and I very much appreciate you kind of verbalizing it, because that's something that when we look at the recent books published over the last 5 years or so on the topic of cross-border or transnational corruption, the majority of them seem to be taken from, or they are written by investigative journalists, right? Such as Casey Mitchell, for example, or Oliver Bullock. And even when they are written by scholars, such as the recent book on indulging kleptocracy by Tena Prelek and John Heathershaw and colleagues, they very much take kind of a journalistic approach to it in terms of collecting the cases and describing them and how they integrate within an academic framework. So in this specific book of Indulging Kleptocracy, the point of the author was to very much focus on the role of the UK, right, as this hub for international flows of illicit finances. Now, because of the structure of OCCRP and what you were talking about, how the point is to support journalists working in a specific context to kind of follow the money. Yes. The difficulty when normally when researchers we think about measuring corruption and thinking about corruption is that even though we realize that it's not tied anymore to one specific jurisdiction, we always by default end up referring back to that specific jurisdiction or a number of jurisdictions. Yes. So earlier I gave the example of the Azerbaijani laundromat, right? So I wonder when OCCRP works on this type of investigations, yes, and there's the moment of kind of releasing this information and getting the ball rolling, yes, and eventually, as you mentioned, law enforcement will pick up on that, etc., etc. Does it happen? Do you have internal conversations about how to frame this case to either illuminate the core jurisdiction where this is happening, or one specific jurisdiction that you think it should take the priority for advocacy purposes or whatnot? How do you manage this issue of multinational cases with the necessity of framing events in a way that is understandable to the general public, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, our mission is to expose corruption and organized crime in the public interest, right? So all of our reporting is driven by this kind of public interest test, and what stories need to be told, what does the public need to know about. And Yeah, so I mean, if the story is about a jurisdiction that is particularly favorable to illicit finance, and that's a story we can tell. I mean, a couple years ago, we've done several large investigations about suspicious funds entering the Dubai property market, for example, and exposed, more than 100 organized crime figures, politicians from countries with very high levels of corruption, sanctioned individuals, some people related to terrorist groups, all of who had bought property in Dubai, and who were, action had not been taken by the authorities against that. So I think that's one example where, like, it wasn't the predicate crime or the kind of origin of the money that was the story, but it was rather the offshore jurisdiction that was the story. And that certainly is the case. In other instances, investigations have focused on the professional enablers of corruption. So we've done a lot of reporting on a number of Swiss banks, on groups in Cyprus who provided corporate services to Russian oligarchs to help them avoid sanctions. So it's really trying to shed light on the infrastructure as well as the perpetrators, because in some ways that enabling infrastructure is has more systemic harm than some of the individuals do. So that is definitely like a concerted effort. And I do think it's informing some of the discussions that are happening on the need for corporate transparency, property market transparency, stronger enforcement efforts against enablers, which you're seeing for sure in the UK. There's some good reforms in Europe at the EU level. They have a new anti-money laundering authority, things like that. So yeah, I mean, definitely that's a deliberate aim on our part, and many other investigative journalists as well. Like, I think this infrastructure, really since I would say the Panama Papers 10 years ago, has gotten more and more attention. I guess when it comes to kind of measuring corruption, it's important to recognize that the corruption that's exposed by journalists is impacted by a number of different factors, right? So it's not just like, oh, wherever there's corruption, we're able to go expose it. So I wanted to just mention a few of those factors that really impact kind of where investigative journalists, such as those at OCCRP, can do strong reporting. And that ability depends on, one is the strength of our network. If you look at that network that I described, it's not evenly divided around the world. We have a much kind of stronger network that's produced much more reporting in Eastern and Southern Europe, great partners in the Baltic countries, really kind of post-Soviet countries in general. Our network is very strong, so in Central Asia and elsewhere. Some very good work in Latin America. OCCRP is less strong in South Asia and in most of Africa. That's not because there's, less corruption there. It's just an institutional growth issue. Like, where have we gotten funding? Where did the partnerships start from and have the most time to mature? There's a lot of kind of external dynamics that impact our ability to report at scale all around the world. It's a big place, so obviously our coverage is uneven.
I would like to ask a follow-up question on that.
Yeah, maybe if I could just finish this point, and then is that okay? Just to kind of go through the factors, and then okay. Otherwise, I'm gonna lose track of things. So the strength of our network is uneven, but also the ability of journalists to do their work is very uneven. So media freedom varies greatly from country to country. In specific countries, we are facing threats from the authorities, threats from organized crime actors who we're reporting on. But then there's an increasing number of kind of cross-national threats as well. I mean, we earlier this year experienced kind of the most sophisticated and severe digital attack on our website. These happen regularly, but this one was like on another order of magnitude. And then there's the legal threats, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, these kind of strategic lawsuits against public participation or SLAPP suits. And so journalists are working against these physical, digital, and legal threats at all times. And they're stronger in some countries and on some stories than others. So that's also like very seriously affecting what evidence reaches the public. Often there's, journalists unfortunately have to self-censor in some instances in order to protect their own safety or to avoid really costly lawsuits.
think
I think yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, I'm sorry that I interrupted you earlier. It's just because I fully know that we are now in the conversation, at least putting the key elements in the background of how these type of cases can be measured or how they can be converted into data. And I think like these points are so important. And I was wondering if so you already kind of describe this situation in terms of, we have these different factors in the different jurisdictions where journalists operate, right? Which of course influence the type of cases that we can collect information from, that we can
Yeah.
become aware of, that we can report on, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this is kind of like an impossible question, but I would love your opinion or your common sense inputs about this, because when it comes to corruption and the connection between political corruption and organized crime, it tends to be the case. I feel that those places that have the biggest issue with corruption are also those places where journalists face the most challenges to their physical integrity and to operate and to access information, of course, etc., etc., right? So it's kind of that issue where their work is most needed, there are more constraints to their work, right? I imagine being an investigating journalist in Sweden is a lot easier, but at the same time, there are a lot less cases as prominent to investigate compared to, kleptocracy in South Africa or state capture in Venezuela, etc., etc. So, and this is very much with the idea of start connecting to how this can be transformed into data. Like, how do you have a feeling about how this global perspective, if we were to start comparing jurisdictions or group of jurisdictions, right? uh, Using information produced by investigative journalists, like how can do is there a way to balance this out, or at least some other than the factors that you mentioned, that could invite researchers to think, okay, if I kind of control for the level of freedom of the
Yeah.
press, for example, in different jurisdiction, I may be able to
Mm.
kind of correct for the number, and be able to
Yeah.
compare jurisdictions that are otherwise very different.
I mean, it's a fascinating question. And just to put two more factors on the table, another one is the availability of information. We have done a lot of reporting on illicit wealth in the UK recently, in the last few years. I would say that's driven by the fact that there is a lot of dirty money in the UK, but also that there have been really like world leading transparency reforms in the UK, where they have a publicly available, easy to use, open data standard beneficial ownership register for companies there. And they have a similar register for the companies that are from foreign companies that own UK property. That kind of data is not available for many European countries, certainly not from the US, where I'm from, much less China or places where getting information is extraordinarily difficult. So I think that's another one of those kind of externalities that's affecting the distribution of stories. Um, and then I think another one is funding. Investigative journalism is extremely expensive. And so where is it being paid for? And by whom? And we saw, with the US last year, with the destruction of USAID, turns out they were funding a lot of investigative journalism around the world. And so the industry really took a hit with the US exiting the space. And so, yeah, I think it's a combination of these threats, the availability of information, the funding, the presence of these journalist networks, all of which are impacting the scale of the reporting. To answer your question about how you would control for that, I don't know. I think what is inspiring from our network, but what makes it more difficult is that even from the countries where all of those factors stack up against journalists, you're still seeing great reporting. I mean, we have partners who are working in exile from Russia, from Belarus, from Venezuela, who are doing incredible reporting about corruption and other governance challenges. And so, they're like working against the odds, I guess, and still continuing to do that really brave and difficult work. And so I may need to punt that question to the great academic minds who are here. But hopefully having some of those factors in mind might help.
Thank you so much. No, I think this is a great point, and sorry again for interrupting. Please.
No, it's great.
Continue.
It's nice to have more of a conversation, actually. Um, I thought it might be useful to mention a few of the types of corruption that we expose. Just to kind of bring it down into reality a bit more about, how investigations can shed light on the scale of corruption. But again, that's not easy. I'll mention just like three types quickly. Um, One is, we do a fair amount we've done a number of stories on procurement corruption. And these are some of the ones where you can start to kind of put, in some instances, a number value on the losses. We did a story recently, or I think last year, the year before, from Turkmenistan. So again, proving that even in the most difficult conditions, reporting can sometimes come out. Um, and the government of Turkmenistan spent $50 million, 50, to build this state-of-the-art kind of beauty clinic. So you could go and get procedures done there. They did training for cosmetologists, and they did like weight loss programs, and this, in the pictures of this building, like very fancy marble walls and staircases, and above the building was this like 3-story tall kind of, I don't know what, but it looks like a hand mirror that's like sticking 3 stories up above this building, in the spirit of this being a beauty clinic. And so the government had a big opening ceremony to launch this beauty clinic, and then secretly privatized it and sold it to some companies for around $6 million. So at a price equal to, less than 90% of what it cost to build it. So here's an example of a procurement issue with lots of red flags, and that we were able to report on. And one where you can kind of put your finger on what the losses to the public might be. It was built for $50 million, sold for $6 million. So in theory, maybe they lost around 45 million. There's other procurement cases where that's much more difficult. One of my favorite investigations from this year was about the state-owned mining, also from Central Asia, state-owned mining company in Uzbekistan, where they awarded at least $200 million in contracts to companies with very serious red flags. Like they were pretending to be unrelated parties, but actually they had shared ownership. They were reporting to the UK government that they were inactive, but they were receiving millions of dollars of contracts. But in that instance, like some of the supplies were being fulfilled. And so it wasn't that they were just running off with these $200 million. And so again, calculating kind of the cost of that, was it corruption? What would the cost be is more difficult. But that procurement stuff is one where sometimes it can feel a bit more tangible. more difficult, but where we have a lot of reporting, is on the offshore wealth of politicians and their family members. We did a story last year about the first lady in Sierra Leone, and she and her family members bought about $2 million worth of real estate in the Gambia, next door, between 2020 and 2024. And looking at her family's wealth, this did seem like unexplained wealth, that she was able to acquire these properties. We've also done, as I mentioned, quite a bit of reporting on politically exposed persons, such as the first family of Azerbaijan, who've acquired property in the UK. This reporting, it's often difficult to identify the source of the funds and tie them to corruption. And so that can kind of make it more difficult for certainly for law enforcement to take action, but even to kind of what to count as corruption or not, because typically the politicians in these cases will say like, oh, this was my telecommunications company that this money came from, and they just say the money's kind of fungible when you're in these positions of power. The last type of corruption that I'll mention is state capture, and I'll send this around in the links, but this is a type of corruption that I find really fascinating. As I mentioned before, it's like maybe the most harmful kind of corruption because it's about manipulating the rules of the game, but it's also the hardest to observe. And goes for journalists too, not just law enforcement. And so a colleague and I really wanted to kind of look at what OCCRP's reporting on state capture has said. And so we looked across our reporting from the past 5 years and found 50 cases where it looked like we were reporting on state capture. So instances where a powerful party received some kind of advantage from the state or was like lobbying to change the rules in ways that were problematic. And that, if you're interested in state capture, I think it helps provide some more empirical examples of what it looks like in practice. I feel like a lot of the conversations on state capture defer to the same examples of kind of South Africa, Sri Lanka, Hungary, the US increasingly. And whereas I think our cases, I brought in some really interesting illustrations from Kyrgyzstan, from India, and elsewhere that I'm happy to talk about more. Let me pause. Joseph?
I would like to invite Charles maybe to comment first.
Good. Hi, Charles. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Alexandra. Good to see you and hear you again. And thanks, Joseph, for the invitation. Alexandra, we had a chance to have Alexandra with us at the OECD in March when we did the OECD conference on building upstream resilience to organized crime as part of GACIF last March. So that was great, and that's great to hear you again. Well, I think there's no need to convince this group that we indeed need better evidence on both, I think, corruption and organized crime and the connection between the two. I mean, there are quite a lot of number on the cost of corruption, but I think on the cost of organized crime, it's not as comprehensive. So from OECD perspective, that's an area where it will be important to work more. And complementary to that, I think in terms of evidence, obviously, investigative journalism is very critical as well. So thanks to the OCCRP to bring this up. But I think what is really inspiring is that in what you present is that it seems that investigative journalists are in a way more effectively collaborating across borders than governments are. So I think that that's very inspiring as well. But in terms of question, because indeed that's a critical role that investigative journalism play. In your view, what can governments do to further support journalists in their crucial investigative role? So that would be my first question, and perhaps another one that is just linked to what you just said. around the ties between criminal organizations and state authorities in different geographic settings and all the state capture conversation. In your view, what are the main commonalities between these cases? Are there important differences across geographies or across cases that will be important for international policy making in terms of disconnection between state capture by organized crime? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charles. In terms of what governments can do, protection and funding, and it's not super complicated. It's protecting journalists in your own country, but also taking action when they are being repressed in other countries. Again, this is an area where the loss of US leadership is really palpable. I think that you know, in countries around the world, you could often rely on the US Embassy to take a stand when a journalist was dragged into jail, and I think other countries who care about media freedom are trying to fill that space, but there's a lot more that could be done because the threats are growing, and therefore the protection and the outspokenness of that protection also needs to increase, even if it's, you know, a little politically difficult or there's other interests at play. I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can talk about energy security and media freedom with the same government. And then funding. I mean, I think there's a lot of innovative work to try to raise money or find commercially viable forms of journalism, but spending 6 months piecing together an extremely complicated cross-border illicit finance story, that's not going to be commercially viable. It's a public good. I might have a chance to talk about impact later, but we try to track our impact. We've found that our reporting has contributed to $12 billion in fines, seizures, penalties, other financial benefits that have gone back to the public sphere. So that's an extraordinary return on investment. So it does pay for itself in some ways. But I think there's still too much of the sense of like investigative journalism will just be there. We don't have to support it. It'll just kind of magically happen on its own. And a lot of the funding that does come it's for trainings or for like elaborate new tools or whatever. And what's needed is funding for the journalism itself. Like people have to pay for these journalists to do their work. So I think protection and funding are the answers there. In terms of the commonalities across cases, particularly around organized crime, I think it's kind of what you're saying, Charles, and what the gentleman from Interpol also said is that like the interconnectedness between corruption and organized crime. And it's not just, I think what we think of is like, you've got an organized crime group that's paying off an official to turn a blind eye or to, you know, help them smuggle drugs onto a ship or whatever. I think what we're seeing in more countries in our reporting from the Balkans sheds a light on this. Our reporting from the Pacific Islands sheds light on this, is organized crime groups, you know, really engaging more in state capture and kind of acquire in the kind of boundaries between political power and organized crime groups kind of getting blurrier. And that obviously is very concerning and a trend that deserves more attention.
Nikki?
Hi, Alexandra. So I'm a project leader for a project in South Africa with the Institute of Security Studies that's focused on state capture and corruption. We've developed an early warning system, and that's in development at the moment. It'll be live probably at the end of the year. And it covers institutions in South Africa. on a large scale. I'm interested in how, when you mentioned that you had gone into past stories and you'd found with 50 of them there was state capture. I'd be interested to know more about how you diagnosed it and if you measured any aspect of it. But I don't expect you to answer all that now in your session. I'm happy to be directed to the work and go and have a look.
I just put the link into the chat to where you can find the paper. I mean, we basically looked for the symptoms of state capture, like reporting that aligned with those symptoms. And so we're not claiming that each of those cases is indeed full-scale state capture, which, as you know extremely well, can take different forms at different stages. And so it was really looking at more like where have we reported on undue influence or favoritism or these kind of micro level practices that could be evidence of state capture. Some of the cases were very clear, and I think this early warning system is so important because once state capture gets going, it's very difficult to dismantle, again, that you know better than I do. So I think what was frustrating in particular was reading our reporting on Kyrgyzstan over the past 5 years, and you could really see the early signs of state capture getting going 4 5 years ago, where the president was, dismantling procurement rules and moving more public spending under the presidency and under the security services. And then just over that 5 year period, having that type of rule really cement in and solidify. And so you feel like the chance to do anything about it maybe was missed a bit, because I think there isn't that alarm or urgency that comes when these things are just kind of getting started. And I think that's a really important thing to look at, and I see it very much in the US where I'm from, where the judicial authorities and other parts of government are being conscripted into doing political work and acting on behalf of certain actors over others. And again, it's a alarming trend because you know where it could lead to. But I'd
Great,
love your
thank
feedback on the paper. If you have a chance to look at it, I'd love to talk
you.
more about this.
So, Alexandra, I would also like to ask on the point of constructing cases for reporting. Yes, and I know that the report that the Illicit Finance Data Lab released recently also addressed this point about the relevance of collaborating with academia, about how to handle complex cases for which evidence still being collected, and of course these are cases that are not prosecuted, and as we all know, the frequency of SLAPs, right? These strategic lawsuits that have been like increasing over the last number of years. This book that I referred to earlier about the indulgent kleptocracy, they had to address the point from the first chapter about how they had to consult with the legal department in the university because they were going to be naming some names, and it's all very delicate. So I know that this question about the weight of the evidence before releasing a report is quite crucial for investigative journalists. Although I imagine that depending on the organization and the country, like the specific standard of how much is enough will vary. Yes.
Yeah.
In terms of collaborating with academia about how these cases then can be transformed into data and how to manage this data. I wonder, I don't know if you would like to answer this now already when you're talking about the Illicit Finance Data Lab, but I do wonder how OCCRP sees this threshold, at which point you say, okay, there's enough evidence that even though law enforcement agencies are still not dealing with this, this is something that we feel legally comfortable reporting on. And I don't know if you could then maybe also say something about how then researchers could also pick up on these cases and mention them in our own academic papers.
Great. And that's a great segue to talk about the data lab a little bit. So we have very strict fact-checking standards. Every statement that goes into a story needs to be evidenced. OCCRP is even stricter than most places where, we only use source accounts exceptionally. Like we really err on requiring documentary evidence of the statements that we make. And, we have to do that in order to put out reliable information and withstand the legal threats that we get. So, I mean, we're sued quite regularly, but we tend to not lose because what we're putting out is verifiable. So, I mean, I think, but the crucial difference with academics is there are different legal standards, right? So like there's established legal precedent and it varies from country to country about the public interest defense. So journalists have this public interest defense that if you're reporting in the public interest, you're allowed to, do different things, say different things about different people. The legal precedent for academics is different. The standards are different. So it's not a one-to-one comparison. But I do think there's a lot that the two groups can learn from each other about how to responsibly talk about real corruption cases. Academics can also often, who are doing more quantitative work, what we also see is they can anonymize things more, like they can do more work kind of looking at trends that doesn't require naming names. And so, of course, the legal risks are a lot lower. But for those who do want to do that more descriptive case-based work, I think there is a lot that can be learned about how to manage libel risks and go forward. Just to quickly mention before the next question, the Illicit Finance Data Lab. So OCCRP is a data-rich organization. As I mentioned, we have a large data team that is regularly scraping public sources of information. We buy data from commercial sources, and we receive a lot of leaks, and we're shared a lot of leaks by other organizations. We, like most journalism organizations, are sitting on top of much, much more data than we have the people to look at. And that is not serving our anti-corruption community very well. On the other hand, within academia, as many of you would know, there's a demand for new, interesting data to do research on. And there's a lot of data skills that are quite different from what journalism organizations had. And so we created this Illicit Finance Data Lab to try to help those two groups to work together particularly on data projects. And we just wrapped up kind of a initial phase of work. We produced some guidance papers, and one of them is kind of on what you're talking about, Joseph, is like how to approach working on leaked data. So if you're an academic who wants to use leaked data in their work, what are some of the considerations you should have about security, about legal risks, about ethic board approvals, getting into the practicalities of that. There's other guidance notes there about working on doing research on crypto and how crypto is being used for corruption purposes, and other topics. We also identified a number of data sets that researchers may not know about, but that could be shared, that we could share them with researchers and they could feed future research. And so we kind of did an inventory of those data sets. But I think what was like most exciting are the actual collaborations. And so you've mentioned the Indulging Kleptocracy team with John Heathershaw and others. We're working with them, giving them access to some of our databases to do network analysis of enablers. So doing kind of larger scale network analysis than what they did in their book, helping kind of them get the data they need to map the different service providers and how they're all linked together. And there's a number of, there's like, I think I counted the other day, there's 12 or 15 little collaborations that started through this data lab. Looking at property was a big area of focus. Crypto, as I mentioned. There's also a lot of interest in kind of Russia illicit trade, sanction evasion stuff. So it's really trying to create a space where journalists and academics can play these really complementary roles and like lowering the barriers to cooperation. I put a link in the chat to the kind of final report for this kickoff phase, which has a lot of these lessons in it. But it's on this website that you can join. It's like you have to be a member. But if you're interested in this, please reach out and we can add you to the list and keep, because we're really eager for more researchers from different institutions to participate.
Thank you so much. Sung-Young?
Hi, first of all, thanks for inviting us on Interpol. My name is Song Yong-gang. I'm working at the Interpol Financial Crime and Anti-Crime Center. Same with Diego, and I also like to deliver my deep appreciation to Alexandra and the other the teams who are working for as investigative journalists. Because in the end, they are the ones who are pushing our member countries who are sometimes not really aspiring, opening a case into some corruption cases. But in the end, also the journalists work shed light on those cases so that our member countries can dig into the cases and really turn into an investigative outcome. And my interest in this major corruption comes from also my academic interest in major corruption. I would, instead of using these the perception-based, subject-based CPI, I feel using those the UNCCPCJ statistics-based the corruption measuring together with the hidden crime index will be better. So and that is my interest came from. But today's question, more not from the academic or a more the theoretical perspective, I'd love to focus more on the operation perspective, as I am now working as an Interpol officer. And because we are using a lot of data, and those data are normally data provided by our member countries. So for instance, if the member countries investigate a corruption case, and if they need information from the other countries, they send a request to us, and those the identifiers and IBAN accounts and wallet address, all those relevant information are incorporated into our database. And our analysts who are working for us also use the OSINT, which could be, or maybe one of those OSINT they utilize would be those the newspaper articles provided by journalists, investigative journalists, etc. So we will definitely utilize your data, which is publicly available. But I'm sure that you must have other data which is not really publicly available, but which could be useful for us as well. So I just wanted to know what types of data you have and what are the publicly available and what are not publicly available, especially among those ones which are not really publicly available, whether there are any data which could be shared with Interpol.
Great, thank you. I mean, we try to speak through our reporting. We try to get the information out in the stories that enables law enforcement and others to follow up. It's, particularly in the current political climate, maintaining independence and a reputation of independence is really crucial for journalism organizations. And so we're not able to share data with law enforcement for that reason. So we really do try to kind of let the reporting do the talking. In some instances, the reporting, law enforcement, as you mentioned, has access to extraordinary amounts of data that we do not have access to.
Sure.
But they're also, of course, facing resource constraints and challenges working across borders and that kind of thing. And so, I can think of a number of instances where we used OSINT approaches, or used publicly available data in ways that law enforcement could then replicate, right? That we did something that you then could do yourselves. And that happens more often. There's some instances in which we have leaked data that law enforcement regularly asks for that we can't share because of that independent position. But there, I think, are many others where we're using tools and approaches that law enforcement can replicate. And we always welcome any sharing that you want to do as well.
Sure thing. But like sometimes although we can access a lot of data as long as there is a legal issue order, but sometimes like the private sectors have those data which cannot be accessible by us with the legal issue order, but sometimes you have those data thanks to sometimes white hackers or etc. And so just wanted to know whether there could be any kind of data collaboration, because like Interpol we are quite at the niche standing, because we are global repository of the criminal record, criminal information. So if we can find match with another institution which have global level of the data, that will be quite a good resource that we can rely on as well. So I was just throwing an idea, because there are a lot of other hurdles that we have to overcome. Even if we want to do it, there should be administrative hurdles that we have to overcome. But first, I just wanted to understand what kind of data you have. But thank you.
Thank you.
So Alexandra, I know that by now we have maybe run a little longer than you originally expected, and I don't want to keep you too long. I know that many of the academicians here, and definitely those that will be watching this presentation on YouTube later in a few weeks, will be wondering about those collaboration that you mentioned between OCCRP or the Illicit Finance Data Lab rather, and specific research projects. So if a university affiliated researcher is conducting or starting a project that would benefit from access to some of the data that have been collected as part of this initiative, what is the process that they should follow? If you could just walk us through a little bit about that.
Sure. So our main data tool is called Aleph Pro. And it has different levels of access. So it's a huge data repository. It's also very good software for conducting analysis and investigations on follow the money cases, the way it's set up. And it's used widely. I mean, there's hundreds of media organizations that use Aleph. There is a level of access for researchers. It has less data in it than what's available to our partner journalists, and even less than what's available to us internally. So you can go to this website, and if that sounds interesting, there's a place where you can go to request an account. We've got a little bit of a backlog, so it might take a couple weeks, but then you'll get access. And if you are doing research on illicit finance, it might be interesting to have this kind of in your toolkit. And then, there's ways you can ask questions within the system from the Aleph team who can help you. If it's more about the, kind of collaboration with investigative journalists on using this type of data, we really are trying to build our network on this. We want to be in touch with researchers who are interested in this type of, data, kind of heavy data work, I guess, on illicit finance. So have a look at the Illicit Finance Data Lab materials. I put my email into the chat, and just reach out to me directly if that appears relevant to your work. So those are two follow-up options, particularly for the more kind of data inclined among you. Otherwise, I'm happy, we want our findings to help you all do your work. And so really eager to be in touch along any of these lines.
That sounds great. And one final question, if that's fine. Because something that has come up repeatedly in this series of roundtables Of course, when we talk about measurement, it sounds normally, or people associate this with statistical analysis and complex quantification, or processes of quantifying phenomena, which certainly there's a lot of that. But we have also tried to stress the relevance of also looking at qualitative evaluations and assessments,
Yeah.
and then how can that be fed into a pipeline for quantification. Yes. So in the data that could potentially be accessed via registration to the illicit finance data lab for research purposes, is there something that you would like to say about, if the certain aspects of it, or this is really an instrument or a source for quantitative researchers and those that specialize, with R or coding, or big data, et cetera, or is there something like for qualitative researchers to enjoy there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I think if you are familiar with OCCRP's reporting, the data kind of lines up underneath that a fair amount. So it is, resources that speak to company ownership, property ownership, golden passports, um, illicit trade with Russia, the themes that pop up in our reporting over and over, as you'd imagine, are the areas where I feel like we have the most to offer in terms of collaboration. I don't know if that's too vague or not. And sometimes it's academics who, you read one of our investigations and they have like an incredibly interesting creative idea for what could be done with that data that the journalists never would have thought about. And like I love that. Like we did some reporting on golden passports and sort of being issued by a certain country to problematic people. And I was chatting with an academic and they're like, oh, we can use that data to test whether this change in French tax policy had an effect in kind of pushing French people offshore, which was nothing like we were looking for bad guys in the data and they're looking to kind of test the effectiveness of French tax reforms. And so that's where these collaborations I think are really cool is these like complementary skill sets, but also like complementary ways of looking at the world where we're like looking for bad guys and the research community is often trying to find kind of trends and explain how the world is changing over time. And I think getting into that part of the complementarity and cooperation is what I'd love for us to be able to do more of.
That's a fantastic message, Alexandra. I completely agree. It's so inviting to hear you say this, and it sounds again, as we were saying, I mentioned when we had our call a few weeks back. um I think this is a tremendous project that OCCRP launched, and I'm very happy to see this out there. And again, I do hope that my colleagues can look more closely into it and see how this can be used to spur innovative approaches to the study of cross-border corruption, which, as you were saying, yeah, it should be like already embrace the fact that corruption is a cross-border phenomenon at this point, and that's pretty much it. Even though, of course, a lot of the activities happen within jurisdiction because by necessity everything is within a jurisdiction. The real story happens across borders, right?
Definitely.
If there aren't any other questions or comments from other participants, I guess we can start wrapping it up here. Lina, please go ahead.
It's just a quick one, Alex, and thank you so much. It's great to see you again.
You.
And I was just thinking, the point you made earlier about kind of building up this public interest test, and when you were talking about the aggressive or at least world-leading transparency reforms for the UK. And I was just wondering what you think are the triggers for creating that alchemy of pressure on government to be able to motivate various actors and stakeholders to invest in investigative journalism, have a more positive view of it. And I'm asking this because we are doing some civil society work here in Luxembourg, where I am, and we know how Luxembourg is well integrated into the financial system. And there's a need to kind of raise a bit more awareness for a need to focus on illicit finance and kind of think of more bold reforms. So just really, how do you start to bring those parts together? And cast the role of investigative journalists in a more positive light, cooperative light, that can work with financial intelligence units and other aspects of government.
Yeah, it's really challenging. I mean, my take on with the UK is I think there was growing awareness of the scale of dirty money finding its way into the UK, that when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened, there was kind of a groundwork to then take action. And it was the effort to kind of implement Russian sanctions and support Ukraine that provided that extra political push that was maybe missing before that had happened, of like, we know this is a problem, but it's not quite up the policy agenda. And then you had a lot of commitment to like, oh, we have a ton of problematic Russian money here in a way that's directly, obstructing our interests. And you saw that kind of surge in, I think, political will following, in the run up to the full scale invasion, and then in the years since then. Obviously, we don't want to see that have to be the necessary thing to kind of push reform forward. I think the other narratives that seem to be working politically in other places, there are a lot of concerns about organized crime and the role that secret money flows play in keeping organized crime operations alive, and the harm that they're causing, in terms of violence in a number of European countries and cities, the proliferation of scam networks. All of us probably know someone who's been a victim to these networks. And so I think that's a powerful angle. We talked a bit about this, I think, but like, certainly true here in the Netherlands, frustrations around housing markets, the idea that money laundering, potentially drives up costs. Although again, I think that's an area that needs more research, but just trying to connect this issue, like trying to just bring it home to the issues that people, care about. And it's not always the easiest thing to do. But yeah, I think that's the shift, is like seeing the exposure of illicit finance by journalists or whoever, not as a problem, but as a good thing that's like that needs to be encouraged. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, it's really hard for the point about bringing it home, that it's relevant to the public and the public sees it as a service, and so I think the entry points that you make around organized crime, that's a concern here in Luxembourg, and also around housing. There's an election in 2028, sorry. And also conversations around deterioration of public finance, and just the size of the public's finances, and revenue not matching how much the government spends. So I think the public being nervous around that. So making those connections. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Well, is there anything else? All right. Then I would like to thank you, Alexandra, again for a fantastic presentation. Again, it's been super informative. I have the website open in front of me, waiting to after the call. I'll be registering as well to see how my own research projects could potentially benefit from collaborating with the data lab. And I do also encourage my colleagues to explore the website, and not just the data again, but the reports that Alexandra mentioned earlier on. I think those topics are extremely important, especially for those researchers that are interested in handling cases that may be a little more delicate. So important guidelines there as well. Thank you everyone as well for joining today, for taking the time, and I very much look forward to seeing you for the next roundtable. Have a great day.
Thank you, Joseph. Thanks all.
Thanks, Alexandra.